So before I ask my question, I'm going to have you really talk about, introduce yourself and really talk about where you're at, especially with the social few.
All right. Hi, so my name is Suzan. I work as head of diversity management at M until the 1st of January, and then I'm going to be doing my company, working with my company called The Social Few, which is a data-driven diversity management agency, which basically means that we implement inclusive infrastructures in companies in order to make inclusiveness a part of the business case, shortly.
And Angela, I'm going to have you introduce yourself as well.
Yes, thank you. Yes, my name is Kristiansson and I work for Tieto. And what I usually say is I have actually two legs. On one hand, I work with employee experience measurements. And on the other leg, I basically work leading the inclusion work in Sweden. And if we're talking about what's the pivotal impact of culture and inclusion, you see how these are getting well together. It's super good to see the data and the impact of the culture that it has and on our employee engagement. To see, we all know that EX is driving the CX, so then we have the impact.
That's wonderful. And what, how are ways that you both talked about including it both in, in the whole role of things, especially with culture, but also just in the infrastructure as a whole. How can you start to really look at diversity through that lens of putting it in through the infrastructure and putting it as part of your culture? How can that be a pivotal part of your organization?
So the how-to. We've gone from the why, and I'm happy that we're past that. We all know why we should be doing this, hopefully by now. We're talking about the how. So basically is, what we look at is, a lot of companies today are looking at diversity groups, like certain groups in companies, like we work with diversity and inclusion in this group. Sometimes it's even voluntarily. Usually when there's cutbacks in companies, that is the first thing that goes away. And it is super, super difficult to measure the impact of these teams. What we usually look at is to implement something that we call the inclusive infrastructure, which basically means that it is a part of what you do every day without even talking about it as diversity management, because you're not doing your job properly if you exclude. So looking at it from that perspective, like how do we make sure to not exclude in our everyday work, whether we work with marketing and comms, PR and such, or we're doing product and service development, business development and such. So let's start at looking at the segmentation, for example. Are we segmenting based on interest, on the classic personas, or are we looking at value-based segmentations, which means basically not the value of the customer, but the values that you come with from when you grew up as a child, for example. If you segment on that, then you have loyal customers, but you also find a broader perspective of customers. You can find the same values in all parts of the same city, country, and context. Like, for example, in Stockholm, we've noticed that when we do that, we find customers both in areas such as Rinkeby, as we find in Täby, because they have the same values. And all of a sudden, we look at the customer and the user or whatnot in another perspective. And that's how you create, like very shortly, that's how you create sustainable brands, because you want to be growing, right? The ones that cannot afford us today will afford us tomorrow, most likely. So not to be like, what do you call it, like dumsnål, as we say, but be like wise about it. And I think like looking at it like from an inclusive infrastructure is to make sure to work from the inside out. So once again, not have diversity and inclusion as a layer on top of everything we do, but it is what we do, in what we do already.
Yes, that's a really good point, because I think you can often look at it, you talk about the policies, you go through all your processes, and that's a really important step because you want to take the bias out. But particularly, as you said, in terms of how do you make it coming out of that theoretical bubble that you have a theory and maybe you have the business case, but how do you make it relevant for people in their everyday lives to feel part? So I'm not sure how many of you know, but Tieto is a tech company. So I got really trying to understand, what are the ways of working that our people are applying. And of course, we work by producing tech, and some things are like SAFe, for example, and Scrum. So I got really interested, like, okay, so what does Scrum mean? How does it work as a production process? And what are the values? And I got really happily surprised to see that, the Scrum values, there are 5 values, and 3 of them are basically respect, openness, and courage. So when you look at these 3 values, it becomes quite apparent that this is also what you need to apply to create a psychological safe team, a space where people actually can be themselves and bring their full self to work. So by now looking at, how we are working in Scrum, how we're creating that transparency and create like innovation in those teams, how does that actually help us to think about, that we are an inclusive team, to make it relevant every day, and not just something that we maybe talk about, in a campaign, or that we say like we want to get up the representation. That's super important, but I think it needs both things.
And what are ways that you can ensure that your workplace is really inclusive? You talked about a lot of those values, but how can you really start to or kind of take it up to the next notch to make sure everybody not only is included and feeling welcome, but also motivated to lead this charge forward and to increase that diversity and to help you lead your goals or live your goals?
Well, I think, motivation and engagement, I guess that's always where we wonder, how do we get the people along? And of course, it starts very much with the why, but also just to step out and start having that discussion. When we came in, when I started, we saw actually in our engagement score that we had for Sweden was 5 points below the Tieto average. And then, of course, we wanted to understand, okay, what's going on here? And we figured out that, hey, this is actually driven by how people feel respected and valued at work and how safe it is to speak up. So we said, like, okay, we need to start having that discussion. And then you say, like, oh, but what do we actually mean with the diversity? What is the difference to inclusion? But we started off and inviting people to meetups, to brown bag lunch. We had communities. You start a Yammer group, and slowly, you're creating a space where people are starting to talk about it. And what actually happened, and it's a funny story, but it's also displaying a little bit of what can happen. So you look always at the representation, and our Tieto leadership team was rebuilt by the beginning of the year, and we dropped out 2 women, and by the same time increasing the number of people, which led to that people basically, the percentage of females dropped, and everyone was like, and there was a big, of course, unsatisfaction in the team. But because we had been able to talk about this all the time, in an open call, all-employee call, a woman took it up and was asking our head of strategy openly and challenging that. It's like, do you think we do not see that? What are the reasons for this? And of course he had to answer that, and that of course then led to that more people were openly talking about this on the floors. So we had everyone in the conversation, and the result of this is that now we are getting a new chance with the merger that we will be going through, and we can see that on those criteria for setting the leadership teams, we have diversity on the criteria. So what I'm meaning with that is that, as I said, like daring to kind of step out and have maybe those little bit uncomfortable conversations so that it's okay to speak about it will create that more people will jump in. And it will not feel, comfortable all the time, but it will help to nudge the organization forward.
And one thing that speed this process up is data. Now that we were talking about data, sometimes it being overrated, I'm kind of a data and insight kind of person, where we look at the inclusive infrastructure from a data perspective. So, an example, we look at the recruitment process and see what perspectives are applying to the jobs. What perspectives are being called for the first interview or the first screening, the first interview, the second interview, the third interview, who gets offered the job, who gets the job. What you can see in that, if you measure only from 3 perspectives, so you can measure language, what languages these people speak. So that's one perspective. Another is age, and the third is gender identity. What we've seen in that kind of research, and it's like, you can hardly call it research because it's enough that you do that 20 times and you can see a pattern. Holy guacamole, we lost all Arabic speaking, like the Arabic speaking perspective on the second interview. What happened? We lost all the female perspective, the people that identify themselves as female on the third interview. And I'm telling you, this happens. We're human beings. But sometimes you can feel it in the stomach, but you don't have the facts. Well, these are facts. And sometimes when you have that like black and white in front of you, you're like, okay, so something went south on the second and third interview, let's look at that. Because then you have like actionable data. So not that you collect data for the sake of data, but actually to do something about it. That's one perspective of looking at it, and it's like super simple to do. We usually measure perspectives also internally, but if you only can choose two things, measure the ones that come in, the perspectives, and the perspectives that leave. You will find like amazing insights on what perspectives are we leaking. Usually when we go back and look at the perspectives in the organization, it is the same perspectives that are not being promoted, that are not growing in the company, and for some reason are not doing well and feeling well. So if you want to have insights that are that are relevant for you, I would say this is something very easy to do within the organization, not the least within marketing and comms. It is a quite homogeneous industry, and it's interesting to see like a lot of companies are interested in working with increasing their perspective density, and they have that like we have that in our goals. We have that like these are the actions, and then we have 90% of the ones that are seeking with high relevant applications. 30% of them are Arabic speaking, Somali speaking, Spanish speaking, or whatnot speaking. I know a lot of companies are looking for those languages, and in the end, none of them get the job. What happened, and where did it happen, and what do we do about it? So that's one perspective. And then, of course, we have perspectives such as disabilities and so on. And that's something that is more difficult to measure in the recruitment process because you don't want to be asking that then and there. But you can measure that if you want in the organization. And one thing that I do recommend is for you to measure is not ethnicity, it's ethnic identity within the organization. Because when we talk about ethnicity, first and foremost, it might be like, oh my God, somebody's asking me about where my parents are from. Because that's basically what ethnicity means. It doesn't say anything about you. And what is interesting is that you want to, of course, measure the perspectives that you come to work with, that you actually add something with, like from a value perspective. And that is not your ethnicity, that is where your parents are from. But if you can identify, and you have the opportunity to identify your own ethnicity or what you identify yourself with. I have 3. So my father is from Syria, I'm Arabic, my mother is from Macedonia, so Macedonian and Swedish. And those are like the identities I bring with me at my work every day. And that is something that is interesting to have with and to know, like, okay, these are knowledges, these are perspectives that are useful for the company, for company growth, not the least. So look at it from that perspective and ask, like, what is your ethnic identity? And usually you get like higher response rate also. People like to be able to choose themselves what they are, not what somebody else is telling you that you are, based on what your parents are.
Yes, that's a really good point. In terms also looking at, as I said, running engagement surveys, how many of you are doing internal surveys, engagement surveys? If you raise your hand, I guess in comms, many of us. I don't know if you get, I got pretty frustrated when I was working from the US before and I came to Sweden and I suddenly couldn't ask all these questions anymore. It's like, okay, how do I actually prepare a case of what are the different aspects and how engaged are we and what's driving our engagement if I can't even put it on the paper? How do I bring it to the agenda in the boardroom? And there are some certain tricks because if you look at, how the on a European level that is measured, you can of course ask questions voluntarily. For example, as you said, like what's your identity, but you can also ask whether you count yourself as belonging to one or two of these minority groups. So have a look at how it's basically used, these questions are formulated and have them voluntary, and then that's fine. And it did quite a lot to us to be able actually to surface it and be able to say like, hey, but we have in our headquarters, we actually have 38 different, not nationalities, but how people basically identify themselves. So maybe we shouldn't have the menus only not in Swedish kind of thing. So it helps you, to just step into the discussions. Use data for it.
Along with that too, I think that there's a big sort of fear along the risk of making mistakes, even though it is a process of figuring this out and figuring out where you can be the most inclusive in ways that make sense, especially, we've been talking a lot about internally to make sure that you have a well-represented organization and that you have, a lot of your culture and your workplace is very inclusive. What are some of those ways that it can go sideways, whether that's internally or externally, and what can you do to avoid them or to at least learn from them and broaden your perspective so that it doesn't happen again?
It's interesting. Good question. So I used to work at a branding and strategic agency where I usually got the crisis brands that were in crisis. Love crisis. Gotta love that, because when I got them, my interest for the mechanism behind the crisis, the insights behind them, was quite fascinating, because you could see that most of the outrageous scandals and whatnot come from the same problem, the lack of perspectives. No surprise, I think, to know what. Looking at from that point of view, I think it's important to first and foremost see, what does that mean for us? What perspectives do we have? What perspectives are we lacking? That is to see the diagnostics, right here, right now, where are we standing? Then look at the perspectives that you do want to reach. Then you look at the perspectives that you actually reach. You probably find a little gap, and you're probably going to find that the perspectives that you represent internally are the ones that you're reaching. The ones that you don't have internally, you have a growth area. Okay, so there's a opportunity for you to grow from a sustainable growth kind of perspective. The second I would say is, I think, I've come in contact with a lot of large corporations that have the view of, if we have diversity in a room, and I quote, om vi har mångfald i ett rum, innovation occur. Automatically. You just come into a room and you have mångfald and diversity in a room, which you can define what is diversity, and then innovation will occur right here, right now, because that's what everybody says, right? Yeah. So that's not true. I think most of us know that, but somehow we have the thing we have to work with diversity, otherwise the level of innovation is not going to go up, and we have growth problems and whatnot. The thing is that what you need in order to make this efficient, if you have a diverse team, you need inclusive leadership. So we've done a lot of extensive research where we could see at the Social Few that if you have high perspective density in a team and you have inclusive leadership, leaders that can facilitate discussions like coaches and have leadership, inclusive leadership training, you get 10 times higher rate on answers on the same question. So we've seen that if you don't have inclusive leadership in a team of 12, you get 12 answers. If you have inclusive leadership in a team of 12 people with high density perspective, you get 120 answers. So what is innovation? I would say innovation occurs when you get a lot of answers to the same question, right? As long as they're qualitative. So what we've noticed is okay, so we get 120 answers to the same questions compared to 12 answers. Can we use them? And we've done that research with 13 companies, and 10 out of 13 companies actually use the answers to develop their products and services. So if you combine high perspective density in a company, in a team, in contexts, together with inclusive leadership, that's when the magic happens. Because you need to be able to understand and harvest from the differences of people, which is amazing to see.
Well, and that sort of reminds me as well. So I had a conversation. I'll bring it back to when I was in the U.S. a few weeks ago. I was talking with a member of the executive leadership at UPS, and she was talking about how a lot of mistakes that can be made, or I would even say to kind of follow what you're saying, the maybe lack of innovation or lack of ideas can sometimes just be due to the fact that there's just not enough, although, like you said, the innovation or the diversity in the room doesn't just magically make these ideas appear out of thin air. The lack of diversity in a room can lead to everybody in the room thinking in the same ways, so that nobody else is able to point out, this might be a problem. Or somebody else might think of it in this way. And I think the discussion, and this leads into, so she said something that was interesting, and when we last spoke, the three of us, this was echoed as well. She said a big thing to do whether or not you have a diversity and inclusion title. So, if you have a culture title or you have a diversity and inclusion title, of course that ends up being, one of your roles. But even if you don't, you have to be courageous enough to kind of be that catalyst. And both of you brought up that word, that catalyst of change, to be brave enough to say something, but also to be the catalyst to inspire others to be brave and to say these new ideas, or to point out what might be unpopular, but what might be wrong as well. And how do you view being that catalyst? How do you do that in ways that might not, be an official initiative, but can encourage others to start adopting this in their everyday, projects or everyday life inside of the company, outside of the company?
That's a really good question. How do I do that? I think that's probably why I went into this role, kind of to start asking a lot of those questions, as you said, like also using data to then maybe pinpoint and say, like, where should I go and where should I go to have those discussions. But I would like to actually play this back and to see that we need to build like a majority of people that feels like comfortable having those discussions. So that's very much how I felt. So when you talk about inclusive leadership, I felt that that's something that we tend to work with quite a lot now. I guess a lot of you have heard about the concept of leadership as a service, or like the growth mindset. I mean, all of these things are going into managers, line managers, agile coaches, being more able, to also emphasize the empathy side of the leadership and not just like the performance. And I think this is the right way we need to go. So we tend to do now a lot of having trainings, having discussions. We're doing roundtables on a lot of the sites where we empower people to step into that, if I say to step into that more softer side of management. Because you also cannot give the people, say, like, these are the questions you should be asking, but you need to create a certain readiness and bravery to be vulnerable and to allow for people to have that questions. And once you create that space, I think every team is having a different kind of discussion that is very relevant for that team. I think that is kind of building this kind of mindset that I feel is happening. And then by using, the tools that you have to be able to build that kind of capacity in the organization, which might not be directly connected now. Then you say, like, oh, that's an inclusion initiative, but it's more about how we think about leadership and employeeship.
Absolutely. I think also, just like you mentioned, it is super important to create like safe spaces in order for you to feel comfortable and safe enough to be vulnerable or to be able to speak up or whatnot. I think also what is important is that we don't put a lot of that burden to the individuals. Like, so you have to be brave or you should be able to. I mean, that would be awesome. If you don't want to or you're not, that's also fine. What you do then need to have is tools. Okay, so how do I go about these situations? If this occurs, how am I going to be an ally if I see something happening in front of me? How am I going to answer to this question and so on? So that you have something to bring out, even if you don't feel like safe or brave or whatever. That makes it easier for you to refer back to somebody else. And I think, like, when it comes to either you have like culture responsibilities or a head of diversity management or whatnot, it is a role, as you mentioned, it is a catalyst role. It is not for us to own this. It is for us to make sure that everybody owns this, that everybody works with this. That's why it is so important for us to work with different parts of the organization and to implement that together with the departments and with the people. So that's why I think it is super important to be, okay, so you're in this situation, you can do da-da-da-da-da. It's like, let's start from here. And when that happens, when people do start to speak up, whether you feel brave or not today or whatever, it shouldn't be on you. You have the tools. Maybe you will develop that safe space together. So I think that there are ways of developing that.
Yes, and if I just because I think what you said is that some people don't feel so, maybe, not as a personality that wants to step out. But again, then that's why I felt it's interesting to look at those ways of working. If you have a clear role kind of to talk about, this is what is right and wrong happening here in this process, then you might be able to kind of bring it up from a very neutral point. But again, you would still bring something up, that the team needs to discuss. And that also helps us to kind of take out all those emotions, particularly I think in a Swedish concept, that it's not becomes something that we all feel uncomfortable with, but that it is something that that's something that we can fix and learn from together to actually improve our team output. And that's already creating then, okay, so that's her role, she's doing that, that's my role, I can say that. And so you suddenly see how that actually develops on a very kind of, if I say so, process or job-related context, but it will also start to build this, to create the knit between the team members, and it will also go to the other basically areas to speak up and make everyone feel more part of the team. So
that's really great, and I love to. I'm gonna do a slight nod to our closing keynote. I don't know if Brandy will bring this up later, but I remember reading a little bit ago that there was a recent IBM study that came out that said soft skills were the most needed coming up with AI and technology, and so that's exactly what you're talking about, and these in creating a safe space and being that catalyst, but allowing other people to kind of stand up and take this role. I think that's so important as communicators, but also, that's so well needed. So it's almost in a way you're helping with their career paths as well and their development, not just a D&I initiative.
Yes, of course, that it means that you're more trustworthy. We talk a lot about authenticity. It's kind of being your true self and being more authentic, and also being able that the other person is it well. So I think we'll all benefit from that.
Yeah, definitely. But I kind of want to not challenge, because I definitely agree that there shouldn't be. I definitely agree with you that there shouldn't. You're like, come on, challenge. I definitely agree that there shouldn't be these set. This is how you communicate and this is how you have to do it. But I do find, and I don't know if you agree with me on this, that there are some D&I goals that are set that are just so lofty, or some initiatives that are set, and they're either so high and so lofty that I think it's easy to miss, and then it's easy to just kind of stay at the same, where you're not challenging yourself because the goals are too high, or the accountability is not there. So while you're not pigeonholing people into having to do one specific thing or do specific actions, how do you make sure that the goals you set actually mean something, and how can you help people be accountable for that, or your organization as a whole be accountable?
Yeah, okay. I think there's several thoughts on that one, so I'm going to pick one. But I guess, of course, you need to have a strategic vision of where you want to go, and it's good. And you will probably talk more around that if that's also sitting, what you want to do in the market and these things. And I guess that's where you need to start. But I feel very much in terms of pinpointing the concrete actions maybe to get there. I feel that external assessments, audits. Benchmark yourself. We do this with other strategy in the business as well. Why not do it on that? Look at what's there. What's the UN combat that you want to sign? Is there a gender equality certificate that you want to gain? Bring these guys in, and they will rigorously go through your organization. They will probably do an employee survey. They will look at your policies, and then they benchmark you against other companies, and you could go to Sweden or internationally, and you will get like a very concrete, heat map to see, and you can pick, what is the gap that you want to tackle first. So that's kind of helping then, of course, more from a, diversity management perspective, but it will be able to, kind of lay out a plan. And then, of course, I think besides of the policies, of course, you have then the other items like the culture and the communities, where you build the space to have those discussions. But it's good to have some backdrop to see, these are the boxes we want to hit.
And looking at it today is if we take, I usually use like 3 circles, so you can imagine like 3 circles now in front of you. Like the first one is society, where we look at society and it has high perspective density, which just means it's quite diverse. We have a market that also has high perspective density. Everybody can buy today. We can't really segment on like, a lot of people can buy today. So just the Swedish population that has foreign background has a buying power of 400 billion kronor per year. So I think like sometimes we feel like, that is not a segment that we need to talk to because it's not like, it doesn't have a buying power. That is not the truth. So looking at from the market, it has high perspective density. Looking at our industries, it's like super low perspective density. It is homogeneous in general, which means that the products that we develop, the services that we develop, we create market imperfections, basically. There are like huge market imperfections out there. The services and products that are not talking to the mass that it should be talking to. We are bleeding money. We are doing sometimes the wrong efforts. So from that perspective, a lot of boards have woken up and realized that if we do want to grow sustainably, if we do want to make sure that we exist in the coming 10 years, we need to do this. Because just 2018, the Swedish population that has foreign background stood for 80% of the population growth in Sweden. Just 2018. So we need to be there, We need to understand all target groups now. Just with that knowledge, it says enough, I think, for it to be a strategic goal. So we need to set strategic goals. Then we need to set KPIs. Then we need to set actions on the KPIs. And they have to mean something because you need to put them together with all parts of the organization. Why are we doing this? Because we probably lack a little bit of perspectives. Because otherwise, if we would, it's quite interesting that it has to be worth money for us to work with. Like, let's start from that. It has business value, and that's why we need to work with it. Yes. It would have been nice if we didn't have to think about it that way, and it would be like natural because we should be representing how the society looks like. We're not. But now we are where we are, and there are like huge, like fundamental market imperfections out there that needs to be solved. And who is going to do that first and the best? Let's see.
Yeah, and I think also what inspired me, so when we met the first time, that of course we heard this morning as well, if you have a business to customer business, then it might be easier to think like, what are my customers? But also like in the C2C, you think then about, but who are your customer's customer? To kind of, because then you might think, my buyers are always, I'm just making this up now, but let's say our buyers are always white men in the middle of the 45. And then you have a good reasoning to say we don't need to look at the markets. We just need to make sure that we represent our buyers. No, because your buyer's company is serving probably an end consumer, and then we're hitting the society. So there you have you maybe need to take that additional step. But I think that's very worthwhile looking in, because we nowadays, we talk about the experience. So if we don't understand how we can help our customer to serve their customers better, they will not choose us longer.
I have an interesting question that came from Marita in the audience. She asked if you see a backlash in diversity in organizations today because of increasing nationalistic and conservative political opinions. I would add to that kind of a part 2 to that question. I think it's definitely, as we talk as communicators in general, diversity aside, that it's nearly impossible to cater to every single person within a singular campaign or message. But how do you, I guess, if you do see this backlash of diversity or companies including it, how do you do these risk assessments? How do you prepare for a sort of backlash, and how do you still stay strong with the stands that you choose?
Good question.
I think in Sweden we are having an extreme advantage of having a diskrimineringslag. And now I don't actually know what that's in English, but it's how do you say equality law that is bounding all of the companies to have like a plan and cater for all the different 7 discrimination grounds. And that's something that, you know, other countries don't really have. So by you knowing that you have that, you will be bound to have a plan, look at what are the impacts and keep working with it. And that allows you to really take it there and nudge it forward. And the good thing is as well that once you work with one ground, you will always be able to have, you know, to widen that space. Because once you talk about, okay, let's say you put an aim on gender equality and you do a gender equality certification and you start taking that steps. And then you end up saying, like, oh, but, you know, we need to think about how we take bias out of our recruitment process. But when you take out bias out of the recruitment process, you automatically look at how to take it out for all the different aspects. You don't think about only about women, but you think about, you know, how do I write a job ad that is kind of actually helping me to just look at the competence and not on everything else. And by that, it allows you to widen that room, and actually maybe you shouldn't then kind of focusing on one aspect, but rather think about how do I create that space again. And when we talked about, you know, this inclusive team leadership and these kind of things, they are not connected to one aspect. And I've just been happening to be in Poland the other day and talking there about inclusive team buildings. And then, of course, you have like a completely different cultural setup. But we had like an extremely good discussion. And all the team members started to speak up and felt also that they feel much more safe and space. And we're starting to challenge each other on the concepts. And that's where we want to get.
Mm. Yeah, good answer. I'm like, where do I go from here? No, but I think what I've seen in companies is that we've been talking about diversity for quite, I would say, a lot the last 3 to 4 years. And during that period, there has been a lot of initiatives, a lot of programs, and a lot of whatnots that had not really been impactful. And companies are like, it's not working. We get a lot of that at the social, like, does it really work? Because this didn't work, the program or the initiative. So usually I was like, okay, tell me a little bit more about your program or whatever you're doing. And the programs, like the other day I heard like, we hired or recruited 20, what do you call it, like nyanlända. Newly arrived, yeah. That was their program. They were super satisfied, but the board felt like it didn't do any impact, didn't have any impact on the company, so let's not do that anymore. Diversity. So the problem is sometimes I think like we don't do it right from the beginning, and we don't really know where to start like properly. So that might sometimes lead to initiatives like not moving forward. You know, we tend to be very comfy in saying it didn't work, so that's why we're not doing it. I would like really recommend to look at like how do we do it properly and for real, and what does that mean like as a business case or whatnot. So that's something that I've seen, but usually they tend to come back, so it's good. But yeah, there is some sort of like backlash on that.
Yeah, and I think you have a very good point there, because, you know, if you say like we have like one action and then that action might fail, in no other area we do this, right? We think about, you know, you need to have like a strategic goal and a plan, and then you try out something. We all talk about, you know, try fast, fail fast, learn, do something, and kind of adopt. And I think if you just have like one little project and then this didn't kind of have the big impact and that kills the whole initiative, then that's kind of just the opposite approach. So more thinking of like a marathon and then having different little incubators and start seeing the whole piece starting to move. I think that's probably more the approach. You kind of, so then you don't fail. You fail, but you fail for learning.
Well, and I love the metaphor to a marathon as well, because I mean I think again going back to both our previous conversations about this, and then I'm going to bring up my conversation with UPS again. There is a very kind of poignant, and sometimes I think it can be a little bit of a downer, but also just empowering because there's so much left to do. She said something like, you know, if diversity and inclusion was something that could be solved, we would have solved it already. You know, we're communicators, we would have solved it already. It's not something you look at as a campaign to end. It's, you know, something that you just keep continuing to do. And what are ways that we can continue to make it better and better and better? Maybe that is, you know, falling forward, or maybe that is definitely, I think that is looking at it as a marathon, you know, with little good things along the way, that you're rewarding yourself, that you're celebrating those victories as well. And I guess that because we're just a little over time, but I know we could talk about this all day. But also to kind of leave it on a high note as well, how do you, because it can get, I think, you know, oh, we just can do so much more. How do you kind of, you know, help the team and help to celebrate, whether that is externally as, you know, your brand value, or internally with a good workplace? How do you celebrate those victories and focus on those victories moving forward to motivate you and to empower you?
Put the people first. I mean, it's we all have social media. So, you know, if the other day, you know, it's the women, they're starting an internal mentoring program. So, of course, you know, it's them standing in the limelight. We shoot this out quickly on Yammer, on the intranet, take a picture, put them on LinkedIn, say like, great, and that's kind of inspires them. You take energy from getting direct feedback. I think we have another person came up and said like, but maybe we could also celebrate cultural diversity. And I would like to say, okay, but here you go, try to do something. There's not a big budget, but what's your idea? So giving a bit of space, and then a lot of people came. Actually, he was doing something in our next to the cafeteria, and a lot of people joined in, and they started to talk to each other and found this very cool. So he got a lot of energy from that. And I think, again, it goes back to like every feedback, so putting the people to the front and not kind of the theory of like we are an inclusive place.
That's a great point. That's a great, yeah, and that drives, I mean, that's something that we keep hearing over and over again. And even a question that got asked earlier, or what, we keep talking about being human, and I think it has a lot to do with putting that emphasis on humans, putting that emphasis on the people and not the theories or not the company as a whole, but it's the people that drive it, right? Definitely. Well, I know that we're going on to our next presentation, but there's lots of good conversations to be had still. But what I would love for the audience to do is give, please, both Suzan and Angela a round of applause for these insights.
Thank you. Good job.